I had been constantly kind of comparing myself to public school. I don't know, trying to make my homeschooling look as much like public school as possible. And I attended a great homeschool conventions the spring of my sophomore year. And that was the first time I had been introduced to ideas of really what I could do, the opportunities I have as a homeschooler, and what it means to be a homeschooler. And that really changed my mindset. So I wanted to do that for other students and other parents in high school because I'd see a lot of families stop homeschooling through high school. Maybe they decided that when they started homeschooling, but it was really a missed opportunity because they were my favorite years of homeschooling.
Welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And we are delighted to introduce you to Nadine Loffer in our interview today. I met Nadine recently when she invited me to be on her podcast, which is called How to Homeschool in High School. I had such an absolutely fantastic time talking to her in that interview. I got off it immediately and said, we've got to schedule her to be on our podcast. And we had just as much fun talking to her on our podcast. And I hope you enjoy this. A word for our listeners. We talk about homeschooling a lot at Unbound because we have a lot of homeschool students and a lot of us were homeschooled. And so just a note that we're not exclusively a homeschool organization. We don't require anybody to be homeschooled to be part of it. But we just happen to be a sort of alternative and different kind of post-high school education program. And that tends to appeal to people that were already bucking the educational trends. And that tends to mean that we have a lot of homeschoolers in the program. We work with a lot of them. So this episode is focused on homeschooling. So if you're not homeschooled, this is a great opportunity to hear a little bit of what it's like from the inside, from somebody who just finished being homeschooled in high school and from a student perspective. If you are homeschooled, I think Nadine has some really important things to say here, some really interesting observations from somebody who has just finished. She graduated in May, is about to attend college in the fall, and yet has a great amount of maturity and perspective to be able to think about what was happening to her while she was in high school and reflect on it well afterwards. And so all those reasons make this a really fun conversation, and hopefully that gives you some context for those of you who are listening about what's coming up next. Nadine, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. It's really fun to have you here, and it's reciprocal because I recently got to be on your podcast, had a lot of fun, and the first thing I did when I got off the podcast was I called Megan and I said, hey, see if you can schedule Nadine to come on our podcast because that was a lot of fun. I'd like to do it again. So thanks very much for being here. Obviously, I know you directly because I was on your podcast, How to Homeschool in High School. And so let's just start there. What made you want to start a podcast, and what was the prompting that kind of got you on that subject and put you on that path?
Yeah, so before I jump into that, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity to be on your podcast. I have been looking forward to this for like the whole week, and ever since I released the episode, my family has been so excited about learning about Unbound. I've been talking about it all the time, and I've gotten so many good feedback and review from that, so I really enjoyed talking with you on the podcast. Thank you for doing that as well.
It was a fun interview. I had a blast.
Yeah. And so with my podcast, it started my sophomore year of high school, really, was the first time I had the idea. And during the first years of homeschooling, so I've been homeschooling for 8 years. I'm currently a graduate, so I can't say I've been homeschooling anymore. I graduated from high school in May, but I homeschooled for 8 years. And through high school, I had been constantly kind of comparing myself to public school. I don't know, trying to make my homeschooling look as much like public school as possible. And I attended a great homeschool conventions the spring of my sophomore year. And that was the first time I had been introduced to ideas of really what I could do, the opportunities I have as a homeschooler and what it means to be a homeschooler. And that really changed my mindset. So I wanted to do that for other students and other parents in high school because I'd see a lot of families stop homeschooling through high school. Maybe they decided that when they started homeschooling, but it was really a missed opportunity because they were my favorite years of homeschooling. So I really wanted to try to change that a little bit. And my dad challenged me to use my love of homeschooling to help other people. And I honestly don't really remember why I chose podcast. Because I wasn't even I don't listen to podcasts. Now I do, but I didn't then. And for some reason, I jumped right there. And I could have started with something smaller, like, I don't know, an Instagram page or something like that. But I was like, no, we're going to start a podcast. And I was actually just listening to one of your episodes that you did a while ago with 2 of your students that started a podcast. And you were talking about how cool it is to have that opportunity to just get out your laptop and record something. I've had listeners from Australia And every time that happens, I'm like, I can't believe I'm in my basement recording and talking to myself about homeschooling and someone from Australia is listening. Like, that's just such a cool thing to be able to do. And I've learned so much about myself through the process, but just about homeschooling, and I've watched people like become more excited about it. So that's been a really fun journey. I'm very blessed to have that opportunity.
Yeah, and that's an interesting little rabbit trail. We spend a lot of time wringing our hands about technology, and there's good
Yeah.
reasons to do that. I mean, there's obviously a dark side to all these different technologies, and you can spend all your days. I know that I occasionally will find myself wandering around the house with an earbud in, listening to a podcast, and then think, "Is this the best way to be interacting with my family?" I mean, yeah. So there's always an ability to abuse. But on the other hand, if you care about relationships and you like communication, what a marvelous, amazing, wonderful world to live in, right? I mean, like, you can do a podcast, which we're doing here, which you've obviously done, and that's really exciting. But I just am just blown away by how often I learn things. And in this case, we built a neat relationship here where, you invited me on. I was like, well, that was a super fun conversation. Do it again. And so sometimes maybe it's a little underappreciated. Every once in a while when I'm flying, I'll be like, this is really incredible. Like, I'm hurtling through the air at 30,000 feet, several hundred miles per hour in a steel tube, and it's safer than walking down the street. That's just mind blowing. And, here we are. We're sitting in our respective houses and we're having a conversation, and somebody in Australia or someplace else could be listening to this. And we're striving to be a blessing to them. And that's pretty mind blowing, too. Well, the three of us have something in common. We all homeschooled high school. I don't often get to do that in terms of having that kind of equality across the board here. But I also remember in a different era to some extent. But, there was this, I thought it was interesting. You said you were comparing yourself to public school folks. And I was constantly like the complete oddball. And my brother and I had these strategies to steer conversations in different directions so that we did not have to explain for the 900th time why we were homeschooled. And yet, I think you've reached something that took me a little longer to reach. It wasn't until after I graduated from college, and then I had a sort of deep appreciation for how my education had prepared me totally differently for the world in almost every respect. And so you said that your dad sort of challenged you to think about, and you said you enjoyed those homeschooling years the most. Talk about that a little bit. What was it that you enjoyed the most about being homeschooled in high school? Because I think that's maybe a slightly unusual self-awareness to have realized that when you did.
So a lot of the homeschoolers I do talk to on the podcast, they'll, at least when they're graduates, they'll talk about how, like, looking back now in college, they can see how much homeschooling benefit them. But in the moment, they didn't see it. And I was, I think, blessed with that realization through the convention and then through my parents and through a few other experiences I had. And I think the thing I've loved most about it, honestly, has been the ability to do things like start a podcast, or my sister and I, we love riding horses. And so we've been able to do that more, and just being able to be 100% myself through high school, which is not everyone's experience, especially in the, conforming culture of public school sometimes can be like that. So that has been amazing. My friendships that I've grown through the community that homeschooling has offered have been some of my favorite things in comparison to the friendships I had when I was a public school student, because I was public schooled up till 4th grade. So I did have some of that perspective also, which a lot of lifetime homeschoolers don't have necessarily. Like, I know that not everything that people tell me about public school is actually true. And so that was also helpful in my perspective. But my relationship with my family and Christ have been probably the biggest blessings, because I wouldn't have the relationship I have with my sister had we been separated our whole, school education, and then my parents, our relationships, and those will last me a lifetime, I think. And I can already see that now as a graduate, even as a senior. Like, those were going to be big blessings in my life. So those are like the little things, but they're big things as well that make homeschooling so special to me.
Nadine, I am curious on one specific point that you talked about there. Just, I remember in my growing up years of homeschooling, I had several years, especially around the time where I started getting into high school and my parents chose to homeschool me, where several of the other families of kids who were similar my age ended up deciding to put their kids into public school because specifically they said, well, we just want them to be able to get more of just like that social experience and have more like friends and like more exposure to a wider community. And I always found that to be a little odd because I thought I have a really great community and I've really enjoyed the fact that I have been able to be homeschooled and to really just lean into that community. And I would felt like it was a loss for them. And so I would be really curious to hear because that was something that you highlighted as a specific benefit. While I think a lot of parents and families have not really seen it that way, what has that been like for you as you've kind of gone into the high school years to see homeschooling as a benefit to you having close friendships and community?
Yeah, so our story it's not always been like that. We moved up to Pennsylvania when I was in 7th grade. So we started homeschooling when we were in Florida, and we moved up to Pennsylvania, and we left a very vibrant homeschooling community that we had there and my connection to public school. So I had a lot of friendships. And we moved up to rural Pennsylvania in like the middle of nowhere, and we didn't know anyone who homeschooled, but we were around our family, and that was really important to my parents. So my mom did a very brave thing. I look back at that and think, wow, she really was trusting God to provide for her. And during that period, she would pray that the Lord would provide streams in the wasteland. It's a verse from Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 56 or 52. And she would pray that over and over again. But during that season of our life, we really didn't have too much of community. But what she did do was she went on Facebook and she searched up like the closest homeschooling group she could find. And we attended literally every single event. Not necessarily like we had friends right away, but we were still getting into that community, and that process took a very long time. So whenever I do talk about my social experiences now, especially I post a lot on Instagram to like hopefully get these people talking about stereotypes in homeschooling and breaking them down a little bit. But I show videos of my very thriving community, and I'm always cautious about that because it wasn't always that vibrant. That took years of my mom actively putting us in situations and growing those friendships. So that's one thing about homeschooling and socialization. Like it, not only when you homeschool, you take control of your academics, you also take control of your social life. I heard that one time and I just cannot think of a better way to say it. Like we need to be sure we're as focused on academics as we are on social opportunities because they're both equally important, I think, in the life of the student. So my mom was very intentional in that. And that really, really paid off in the end. Like our community has been amazing, but it's been grown. And another thing that I have recently been thinking about when it comes to homeschooling communities is they're built on the idea of belonging versus the idea of fitting in, which I heard this the other day also on an Instagram reel I was watching. Like we enter in those communities not trying to be anything but ourselves, and we're accepted that way, or we're not, and we move on to a different community. But in school, like we're all they're forced to fit in a way that's kind of unnatural. At least I didn't experience that completely because I was still a 4th grader and we're still very individual as 4th graders, but I was still getting picked on a little bit for my faith and for praying before I eat and those little things that start when you're younger. And I remember that. And it's just a different foundation. And I think it's a really beautiful foundation because it never asks us to be anything other than who we are at our point in our lives. And my mom always talks about that as a huge blessing about homeschooling. And I totally agree.
That's a really interesting. I've never heard it put that way. That be who you are instead of having to fit in. I think the one trait that I have noticed most often in my own children and then the folks that we work with that are homeschooled to the program is that really deep-seated confidence in who they are. And I don't mean
Mm-hmm.
that everybody has it, and I don't mean that that's a guaranteed outcome of homeschooling, but there is a marked difference in terms of peer pressure and things like that. Years and years and years ago, we first started doing live events for Unbound. And if you're in the homeschool community, bear with me because this is going to sound mildly insulting, and I don't mean it this way. So just hang in for a second. But I had a colleague, and he came to me, and he was a homeschool dad, so it's not like he was inside the camp, and he said, "There are two kinds of students that are coming here. There are the awesomes." And so what he meant by that is that these are the students that were like starting podcasts and starting businesses and sort of overachieving, right? And just like people were like, whoa, look at them. And then there were what he considered the odds. And these are folks who maybe did have some social awkwardness or they just were kind of half bubble off on timing and social interactions or those kinds of things. And he didn't mean it as an insult. He just meant that they stood out a little bit from the group. So he called them the awesomes and odds. And so we had that observation. Well, then we had the event. And the first night and we had both had a lot of experience running youth events for like churches and things. And so we knew exactly how these events went. You had the jocks in one corner and the geeks in one corner. Like we had that kind of stratification. And so we had a social time at the opening ceremony that we expected to last about 5 minutes, and then people would move to a recreational time. 3 hours later, there were groups of people sitting on the floor still talking. And my colleague looks at me and he's like, what's happening? Like he just couldn't, he didn't have any frame of reference for what was going on. And honestly, I'm not sure that I did either. And so we went back to the cabin super late that night. We never made it to the recreational place. Like everybody just stayed and talked. And he said, okay. He said, there was no distinction between the awesomes and the odds. In other words, there was a total integration across all of those groups. And there was no kind of like, you're not cool enough to be in this crowd or not. And he said, that was just the most bizarre thing that ever happened. What has been fascinating was because of that observation at every Unbound event I've gone to, which have a lot of homeschool students, they're not exclusive, but I have seen that same integration. And I've always just been amazed by that. And what happens afterwards is both sides benefit so tremendously from each other, right? I mean, and again, they both have tremendous amounts to offer. And what you find out is the odds really aren't that odd. But in another setting, those folks wouldn't even get any chance to be heard or be seen. And so it is this kind of incredible thing. So Nadine, you've done a really great job articulating some of those benefits, but play the other side of the coin. You have a maturity to be able to get some perspective on what's happening. And you saw earlier, this is the best part of homeschooling. What are some of the struggles of being homeschooled in high school? What do you see as some of the harder or more challenging aspects of the path that you have chosen?
There's definitely a few of them, and I never want to shy away from them, especially on the podcast. And I was actually recently talking with a girl who was homeschooling in a different country, which is a very unique situation, but she was struggling a lot with finding a social group. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that I've seen students come up to me and ask me about. Like, either their parents are unable to drive them to certain events and they're kind of just at home a lot of the time, and then having the confidence to go out and meet new people is also something that I've struggled with, especially in that period I talked about when we moved. Like, if it wasn't for my mom, I would have just stayed home the whole time because I'm more of an introvert. So that's been a little bit of a challenge. And then, I don't know, I think confidence in our schooling is another thing that I struggle with. I've definitely been that odd homeschooler, the weird one, and a lot of different social settings I can pick out. But being confident in my schooling is something. I was recently at a college orientation, and I just tend to stay quiet about it and listen to the public schoolers just talk about stuff because I don't know how to interject in the conversation, and that's been interesting. I'm interested to see how the next, year or so is going to go with integrating into that. But I think those are probably, social-wise, that's probably the biggest concern. But my mom actually ran across one regarding academics. When we first started homeschooling, she had a conversation with a extended family member of ours who cornered her about how she was going to teach me physics in high school. And that's been something that we get a lot. Like, how can you do science from home when you don't have a lab and that sort of thing? And at the time, she had no idea. But down the road, the Lord provided a great science program. And Dr. Wiles the reason I'm going into physics. And I ended up having a great experience. But those little things that kind of, I don't know, we get thrown at by society or different people, like the discouraging things that keep us from being confident in our, a very valid way of education, kind of keeps us quiet. So I've been trying to break that in myself and hopefully encourage other people to do that as well, because we never know the effect we'll have on like the future generations of people who will decide to homeschool because of their encounter with us or us just being more than the stereotypes tell us we should be. So I think those are the two I can think of right now, but I know there's a few others that have been challenging for me, for sure.
Often in life, we find that, I think especially in the Christian life, there's an ingrained desire to avoid suffering. And yet there's this constant mantra through the scripture that you're likely going to suffer. In fact, you should assume that suffering is part of it. And, from the outside, that looks terrible. And then you go through some suffering, and it's not that anybody enjoys suffering. But we've had a guest on this podcast, and he's a speaker at some of our events, Scott Grant, and he says you should never waste a good suffering. And often you come out the other side and you look at that and you go, okay, I would not choose to do that. And I'm not necessarily pleased that happened. And yet there are lessons that I learned from that end up being lessons that I just have to be honest and know I would not have learned otherwise. And those lessons end up changing the rest of my life in some pretty profound ways. And now I don't want to be trite with that, and I don't want to give that a blanket assessment for like any kind of suffering. There's certainly extremes types here that I don't know that you get a good balance out of, but I'm talking about the day-to-day sort of harder things. And so there's an aspect of often you look at something and the flaw ends up becoming the feature. And I think that one of the things that I have now observed as a homeschool graduate myself and then working with lots and lots of homeschool students is that there is, and I think Nadine, you did a great job putting your finger on something. There is that insecurity. I know, I was probably almost 40 before I finally confronted and was like, you know what? I don't think it matters that I didn't have all the labs quite right in high school. You know, I mean, like I was still like, I kept thinking there was going to be a gotcha moment where I was going to show up for an interview or something and be like, aha, you didn't really dissect the frog correctly in biology. You know what I mean? Like there was just this
Yeah.
like lingering doubt that like maybe I missed some really critical thing. And, around the age of 40, I was like, well, I got all kinds of problems, but I don't think I can now blame it on what I did or didn't do in high school. Right. And so there's a point here where I think that there's this insecurity, and yet the insecurity itself, the kind of you're not doing it the rest of the way everybody else is, ends up being this really incredible feature where it forces homeschoolers and their families to have to think about what it is that you're getting out of this. So you used an interesting example. You talked about, you don't have enough labs or how you're going to do physics and all those kinds of things. But I want you to kind of think back about that. So how did you answer that? So are you the oldest in your family? Are you the first kind of through?
Yep.
Yeah. So you're on the cutting edge. And so just describe to us a little bit. Now, I happen to know from our previous conversation that you were about to go to college for math, right? So you're in the sciences. So how did you go about dealing with that supposed weakness in the high school education? I mean, obviously you got admitted to a selective college. You're on your way to doing a STEM major. How did you go about overcoming that?
Yeah, so it was actually a few things. My mom, again, who's been, so influential in my life, but she asked a question at actually, it was our piano teacher who studied biochemistry, I think, in college. And my mom, she was a homeschooler. And my mom was like, okay, well, she did really well in science. I'm going to ask her what she did. So she was the first one to introduce us to the science curriculum that we end up using, and my sister is now using through high school. But ultimately, my mom didn't know how to answer that question when she first got asked it. And she was very honest about it. And that's, I think, a big part of homeschooling is we kind of have to accept that we don't know all the answers. And sometimes we're going to have people ask us questions that we're not going to be able to answer in the way we want to answer because we don't know what's going to happen next. It's kind of a daily, yearly thing of trusting God to provide for us and asking the right questions, which is what my mom was able to do. So through that experience, I was able to not only take advanced level chemistry and physics, but absolutely love it. And it was, a large part to do with the curriculum. Dr. Weil was my science teacher, but the thing I love about talking about this, though, is I didn't have a lab to do all the equipment, and I did take a dual enrollment class at Grove City last semester, and all the other high schoolers knew how to work all the equipment. I'm like, I have no idea what any of this stuff is, but I do understand fully how to do the experiment well, and learning the instruments and everything. That's you just need to be taught how to do that. That's not fundamental to the actual science we're doing. And I realized that that's the most important part. And through homeschooling, I was able to do labs all over my house. So everywhere I go, I see science and I see the way the world works and how God created things, and out of the most ordinary things that I've been able to use. I wouldn't trade that for the most advanced lab. And honestly, I tell a lot of parents who are concerned about that, it's secondary, learning how to use equipment. That's something you just need to be taught. And as homeschoolers, we're pretty quick learners, honestly. So as long as we have a solid understanding of the actual subject, which most curriculums do very, very well, then, you'll be fine in a STEM field as long as you're willing to work and learn the extra things. But yeah, that's been my experience.
Well, I think if you reflect back and we think about what you just said there, you said, first of all, that you had to be humble and say you didn't know everything.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like an admission of guilt at some level. And yet, the older I get, the more, in fact, I just had a conversation with a friend this morning, and he said something kind of like, well, I don't know, I'm just a hypocrite and grumpy right now. And I said, honestly, every one of us qualifies in that description. The thing you've got going for you is that you were able to stop and say you are. It's when you don't think you're a hypocrite and you don't think you're grumpy that generally you can become pretty insufferable to be around. So the humility is an interesting thing. You talked about asking the right questions. And of course,
Hmm.
listeners to our show will know that we're kind of sort of really wound up about that. And so I would say that asking the right questions is almost always more important than knowing the answers. And I don't mean answers are unimportant. I just mean that if you know how to ask good questions, answers are obtainable. If you don't know how to ask good questions, you can only ride as far as the answers that you have. And then I think you said something else that was really important is that, you made sure that you knew the fundamentals. And so I think that that's a really critical piece. You can figure out how to use lab equipment, but if you know the fundamentals, that's a pretty easy thing. I've seen this with technology. A lot of homeschoolers often don't use technology until much later. And everybody's like, well, you never had to use a laptop. And I don't know if that's that extreme anymore. But I've seen a lot of homeschool students who didn't use a laptop literally until they graduated from high school. And then it was like giving power tools to an expert woodworker. They already knew all the fundamentals of interaction and social communication, all those kinds of things. And then you gave them an opportunity to create a podcast or get on social media. And they used it in some really unique ways because it built up the basics where their peers often are really good at, say, using lab instruments, but don't have any idea what the science is. And
Yeah.
so I think those things are often sort of overlooked. Like people miss that core stuff ends up being far more important. And homeschoolers often get it because everybody's insecure. Because every homeschooler is like, I'm going to fail this. I don't know. And so then they have to really press deep to do it. So,
Hmm.
so you took the class at Grove City, and I'm curious, was it challenging or was it easy? Like, what was your response to the actual class?
Yeah, so I found it to be just as rigorous as my high school level course. And so it really was not that challenging because I had already done it already. And my teacher did tell me, he's like he teaches in colleges. So he makes this course as at the level of the college students that he teaches. So I had a really good foot in the door, I think, when it came to physics. And there was only a small level amount of information that I didn't know, but that was just secondary. Like most of the fundamentals I already had down, and then it was learning lab equipment and coding, which I didn't know. And if there's one thing I'm always telling homeschoolers to do in the STEM world, I'm like, get a little bit of coding in because that's just such a huge
Amen.
thing. Everyone knows how to code, and I was like, I don't know anything about this. But yeah, that's been a process. But I'm used to educating myself. I know how to do that. So it's just normal territory for me, which has been wonderful as well. And I know Mr. Pudewa talks about this a lot. Like he encourages dual enrollment like crazy. And I love it because it really is the same rigor as a normal high school homeschooling course, like the College 101 classes. And I've definitely seen that.
Well, I mean, today you can get ChatGPT to do a lot of your coding for you, so it may not turn out to be quite the handicap that you maybe thought it was originally. No, I think that ability to teach yourself, I asked that question because, and I don't for a minute think that all your courses are going to be easy, but one of the
Mhm.
big shockers for me is when I got to college, I was absolutely terrified. I was the first homeschool student admitted to college. I was the first homeschool student I knew that ever gone to college. I was afraid that if I messed up, I would be an absolute disgrace to the homeschooling movement, my family, etc. And then I got there, and then after like the first couple weeks, I was like, wait a second. I think I only have to know as much as the professor wants me to know, which was totally different from being a homeschooler where my mom was like, you need to know everything that's in the book. And a constant surprise to me throughout all of college was that I had this massive textbook, and I only really needed to know about 5% of it. That was all that was ever going to be on the test. That was all that was ever going to be discussed. And I was used to having a massive textbook and having to know all of it, or worse, having a massive set of real books and had to know all of it. And so that was an interesting kind of, and again, that's not to say that I thought college was a piece of cake or that I was never challenged academically. And I don't mean that. But the process was very interesting. Homeschoolers tend to have an insecurity. And so consequently, they tend to go a lot deeper. In the process, they tend to become really good at learning. So I think it was really telling what you said there at the end, but I know how to learn. So coding, no big deal. I can, and
Yeah.
you weren't flippant, but I mean, I feel confident that I can learn that. Well,
Yeah.
Nadine, what's kind of your big message? What are the things that you'd like to tell people about, how to homeschool in high school, and now you're a graduate, so you're a veteran. What are some things that maybe we didn't cover that we should?
So I actually have one thing on the college class I want to mention. The thing I struggled with the most probably was the pace of the course, because I talked to a lot of students who do self-paced courses, which I think are awesome because they don't allow that homeschooling flexibility. But college dual enrollment classes, they run at a very different pace than what I was used to. I mean, I was waking up on time every day, which I didn't necessarily have to do. And it was just very much a consuming process. I'm grateful for it. I wouldn't trade the experience. But that was probably, over the content of the course, the most challenging thing about it was just getting everything done in the way that the professor wanted. learning some of the new technology and just running at that higher pace. But yeah, I also noticed that we're very adaptable as homeschoolers a lot of us are in certain ways. And that was one of the ways. Like, it's just a faster paced course than what I'm used to. So, but as of what I like to talk about the most, I think right now I'm actually in the process of rebranding the podcast. As I go to college, I kind of needed a new title. I needed a new mission. And so I am kind of refocusing it solely on encouraging the student who's choosing the different path regarding education in high school and education in college alternative things, because obviously society is not going to, as of now, really give us that encouragement. And there's so many encouraging voices out there who are doing really amazing things. I just scroll on Instagram. If I find a homeschooler who's doing something amazing, I'll just reach out to them and ask them to share their story, because that's been the most inspiring thing for me. So honestly, just to know that you're not alone is probably my main thing I want more homeschoolers to be aware of, because having that confidence that you can really do cool things, small things, big things, whatever it is that you feel that you have the call to do or the margins to do. Like, there's a lot of unique opportunities that we have that maybe conventional schooling doesn't offer, and exploring those options and taking our eyes off of the lack, which we tend to just focus in on when there's so much that we have in abundance. So yeah, shift in perspective is what has happened to me, and I wish it would have happened to me in 9th grade, because I have no idea like how much more I would have done, and I just would like parents to go into that with that mindset as well, that they can totally do this and that they have a community behind them. So that's probably my main message.
So many times I think that we've discovered in Unbound is that people talk about features, they talk about academics, they talk about curriculum, they talk about all these things, and it's not that they're unimportant. It's just they pale in significance to the community. And it's so many times, like Unbound, people are surprised, like, oh, the community ends up being the most influential thing. And I think in homeschooling, of course, we get the constant, what about socialization? And we just, I almost, spit out my water and just be like, are you kidding me? Like that ends up being the biggest asset. And it is almost laughable that in 2024, we still have people that think that that's a detriment in some fashion. And so maybe there's a lot of important points that Nadine made there. But if you're listening, don't miss that community aspect, and don't miss Nadine's story, which is one of leaving a community for other reasons, and then find themselves in another place and working hard to create a new one. That ends up being a life skill that is, I think, colossally underrated. The ability to create community, to get involved in community, to join community. That is the kind of skill that will make almost all the rest of them pale in significance in terms of the quality of your life and what you can do and the opportunities that you have. And so that's not to be ignored. Nadine, thank you so much. It was lots of fun being on your show. For anybody listening, check out How to Homeschool in High School, and whatever Nadine rebrands it to next. It's definitely worth listening to and paying attention to. So go and subscribe for sure. Obviously, you should go follow her on Instagram. We'll put that in the show notes as well. But thank you so much for being on the show. It was just as much fun having you as a guest as it was being a guest on your show. So it was a delight having you. Thanks.
And Nadine, for the record, best of luck as you are starting into your college years. I know that when I went to a STEM school for my master's degree, that if more of my classmates had been anywhere near the caliber of well-spoken and well thought out as what I have heard from you, then I think I would have had a much better school experience. So best wishes to you, and I think you're going to do great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everything.
Well, we finished with Nadine, and I told David that I'm just a little bit jealous of Grove City College, which is where Nadine is going this fall, which is absolutely a good match. We are often saying on here that Unbound is not for every student, and that there are certain academic disciplines that should be done at traditional colleges. Nadine is in one of them, and Grove City is an excellent school that we have an extremely high opinion of. So congrats to Grove City. I think you're about to get an absolutely phenomenal member of your community, and it was a real delight having Nadine on the show here.
It's always so cool to hear just somebody who is able to have that perspective, at least for me as just a fellow homeschool graduate who is looking to go into a little bit more of the sciences and technical fields and things like that, to just kind of talk about our experiences and ways that we've learned from different things like that. And I think Nadine's message, and hopefully in this episode, and if you listen to any of her episodes on her podcast, is that it should be really encouraging, because it's something that, yes, homeschooling through high school is very different and provides you with a very unique set of experiences and ways that you have gone about learning in some of your foundational years, but in a lot of ways, I think it actually gives you a leg up. And like I told Nadine at the end there, is that when I was in grad school at a very technical college, I was very struck at the difference in work ethic and in communication style, and just a lot of differences between the kinds of people that I hung out with doing homeschool high school and these people who are at a graduate level at a pretty high end technical university. And so I think I only say that to say that I think it should be an encouragement to those of you who are looking at homeschooling through high school yourselves or are looking to do that for your students, is that I think it can actually be a really big benefit to them.
And as we close out here, just a word. Nadine said something that we hear a lot, that people, and David referred to this as well. We homeschooled the whole way through, but now we don't do high school. And there's lots of reasons for that. There almost always is an intimidation factor. I don't know if I can do high school. There's a kind of increased pressure from a parental standpoint, like I have to really get this right. I would just add that some of the biggest benefits from the whole homeschooling journey come in high school. I can tell you as somebody who is a homeschool graduate. I can tell you as somebody who's graduated 3 of my own children through high school, and I have another one close to graduating and a few more behind that, that this is the culmination. And to some extent, and I don't do this in a way to induce guilt in anybody. There's all kinds of reasons and individual circumstances, and that's one of the beauties of homeschooling. But as a generality, as a broader statement, my observations are that the biggest benefits come from the high school years. But I also recognize that there is an intimidation factor to that, and there's some scariness to that. And we've tried to step into that. And so we've talked about our high school programs here before. If you go to beunbound.us and you click through to high school stuff, we have 3 high school programs: Declare, if you're looking for a full curriculum; Equip, which works with any curriculum; and Explore, which is specifically designed for 12th grade students. By the time this airs, we will also have been rolling out a new program using Equip that is more of a co-op type of opportunity with local groups that can come together with some real assistance that we have for the coaches that would put that together. And so I would just say that we've had a couple of years now to test and pilot these programs. We've had absolutely phenomenal feedback. They're the fastest growing programs in the Unbound universe right now, and they are designed to make doing high school accessible to anybody who is homeschooling. And not just that, it's designed to plug into any curriculum and to use not as an add-on, not as a make-work thing, but to actually transform the curriculum that you're using and use the actual curriculum itself to teach the transferable skills that your student's going to need to be successful, whether they go to traditional college, whether they go on to something like Unbound's Ascent program, whether they go straight into the workforce or something else. In other words, those universal skills of relational skills, time management, task management, critical thinking, leadership, understanding worldview, all those kinds of things that are going to be essential no matter where they go. Our programs are designed to take the curriculum that you're using, use that as the main content piece, and then have your student think through how they're going through the curriculum that you're in, using and learning and acquiring and applying these skills. I think it's a kind of a different approach than what we see. This is not life skills bolted onto something else. This is something that transforms whatever curriculum that you're using and makes it practical and usable, and guarantees that as your student graduates, they say, I know how to learn. You heard Nadine talk about that. I know how to figure things out. I know how to communicate well. I know how to manage my time. I know how to manage my task. I know how to think through this in a way that's systematized and help me to get to where I need to go. I didn't know coding. I can learn coding. I didn't know how to use the instruments. I can learn how to use the instruments. We're pretty excited about it. We think that you will be too. And so go to beunbound.us to check that out. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode. And until then, be unbound.